The morning Myrtle Lawson walked into Caldwell, Kansas for the first time. Not a single soul in that sun-scorched town turned to look at her. And that was the moment Phineas Reed knew something was terribly, beautifully wrong with the rest of the world. It was the summer of 1878, when the cattle drives were still rolling north along the Kisham Trail, and the town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kansas border like a door left half open between civilization and the wild. Dust was the currency of that place. It coated the wooden storefronts, settled into the cracks of the boardwalks, and clung to the hats and coats of every man and woman who dared call that stretch of prairie home. The saloon on First Street never truly closed. The livery stable smelled of hay and manure and honest work. The general store kept its shelves stocked with flour, dried beans, salt pork, and the particular kind of quiet dignity that comes from simply surviving another season in a place that does not care whether you live or die. Phineas Reed had been in Caldwell for 3 years by the time Myrtle arrived. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that comes from real labor rather than vanity, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn flannel shirt and green eyes that had seen enough of the world to be careful about what they trusted. He worked for the Hargrove Ranch, 5 miles south of town, running cattle and doing the kind of work that left a man too tired in the evenings to do much more than sit on the bunkhouse steps and watch the stars come out one by one over the flat, endless Kansas sky. He was well-liked but not loud about it. He played cards occasionally, drank moderately, and had a reputation among the other ranch hands for being the kind of man you wanted beside you when things went wrong, because Phineas Reed did not panic and he did not quit. He had come into town that particular Tuesday morning to pick up a parcel of rope and a new cinch strap from Caldwell's general store, owned and operated by a wide, cheerful man named Harold Busby who talked constantly about his cousin in Missouri and the price of tobacco. Phineas had tied his horse, a rangy gray gelding named Scout, to the hitching post outside, stepped up onto the boardwalk, and was just reaching for the door when he saw her. She was coming down the opposite side of the street, carrying a large carpet bag in one hand and a smaller leather satchel looped over her left shoulder. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a modest traveling bonnet that had seen better days, its ribbon slightly frayed at one edge. Her dress was a deep brown calico, practical and clean, and she walked with the careful posture of someone who had been taught that a woman ought to hold herself together no matter how uncertain the ground beneath her feet. Her face was honest and open, with large gray eyes that took in the town around her with a mixture of wariness and quiet determination, a small straight nose, and a mouth set in the kind of firm line that suggested she had made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of how the world felt about it. What struck Phineas immediately, what stopped his hand on that door and held him standing still on the boardwalk like a fence post set in cement, was not merely that she was pretty, though she certainly was. It was the complete and utter indifference with which the entire population of Caldwell received her arrival. 3 men came out of the hardware store across the street and walked right past her without a glance. 2 women gossiping near the milliner's shop paused their conversation, looked in her direction, and then looked away as though she were simply another feature of the landscape, no more remarkable than a wagon wheel or a rain barrel. The blacksmith, who could be counted on to tip his hat to any woman who passed his shop, did not look up from his anvil. Even old Chester Webb, who sat in his rocking chair outside the barber shop every single morning and commented loudly on absolutely everything and everyone who came through town, was staring at the far horizon and sucking his teeth as though Myrtle Lawson did not exist. Phineas stood and watched all of this happen in the span of about 30 seconds, and something tightened in his chest that he could not quite name. She stopped in front of the general store. She looked up at the painted sign above the door. She glanced both ways along the street with those steady gray eyes, and for just a moment she looked exactly the way a person looks when they have arrived somewhere new and are taking the first real breath of the place, trying to decide whether it will suffocate them or sustain them. Then she stepped up onto the boardwalk, and Phineas realized he was standing directly in her path. He stepped aside, removing his hat as he did. She looked up at him, and he could see the flicker of surprise on her face, the small readjustment that happens when someone has grown so accustomed to being unseen that an act of ordinary courtesy registers as something unexpected. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Good morning," she replied, and her voice was low and clear, and carried a slight formality that suggested she had been raised to speak carefully. She looked at him for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary, as though she were filing him away somewhere important, and then she went inside. Phineas stood on the boardwalk for another full minute before he remembered what he had come to town for. He went inside himself, and found her standing at the counter explaining to Harold Busby that she was looking for a Mrs. Dorothea Finch, who had written to her through the Methodist Church in Abilene regarding a position as a seamstress and domestic helper. Harold Busby was nodding and scratching his chin and saying that yes, he believed Mrs. Finch still had a room available above the laundry on 2nd Street, though she couldn't rightly say what the woman's intentions were regarding hired help at present, as she hadn't come in for her weekly flour in over 2 weeks, and there had been some talk that her husband's older brother had come to stay and complicated matters somewhat. Phineas collected his rope and cinch strap from the shelf along the side wall, brought them to the counter, and waited his turn. While he waited, he did not stare, because he was not the kind of man who stared, but he was aware of her in the particular way you are aware of a fire in a room that has been cold for a very long time. She thanked Harold, took the directions he offered to Mrs. Finch's laundry, and left the store. Harold turned to Phineas with his usual cheerful blankness. "What can I do for you, Finn?" "Rope and cinch," Phineas said, setting the items on the counter. "Who was that?" Harold blinked. "Who was who?" "The woman, just now. The one you gave directions to." Harold looked toward the door with a furrowed brow, as though he were trying to recall something that had happened a long time ago. "There was a woman in here. I've been standing here all morning. I might have spoken to someone, I couldn't rightly say." He shrugged amiably. "That'll be 40 cents for the rope and 12 for the cinch." Phineas paid him, took his parcels, and walked outside into the bright Kansas morning with the absolute certainty that something very strange was happening in the town of Caldwell, and that he was, apparently, the only person who had noticed it. He saw her again the following Saturday. He had come back to town for the weekly supply run, this time with 2 other ranch hands, a lanky Texan named Dub Carver, and a quiet, serious young man from Ohio named Eli Stamp. They were loading sacks of oats into the wagon when Myrtle walked past on the other side of the street, carrying a basket of folded linens that looked freshly pressed, moving with the brisk, purposeful step of someone who has found a routine and is grateful for it. "There she is again," Phineas said, without quite meaning to say it aloud. Dub looked up from his sack. "There who is?" "That woman, right there, walking past the farriers." Dub squinted in that direction for a long moment. "I don't see nobody, Finn. You feeling all right? It's been hot." Eli looked too, with a different quality of attention, more careful and earnest. He shook his head slowly. "There's no one there," he said. Phineas looked at them both, and then looked back across the street, where Myrtle Lawson was very plainly walking past the farrier's shop in a cream-colored blouse and a dark skirt, her hair pulled back neatly under a small flat bonnet, the basket of linens balanced on one hip. She was as solid and present as the wagon they were loading. "Never mind," he said, and heaved another sack into the wagon, but he did not let it go. That evening, sitting on the bunkhouse steps with his coffee going cold in his hand and the first stars appearing above the flat horizon, he thought about it with the methodical patience he brought to most problems. He had not imagined her. She was real. She was living in town, apparently working for Mrs. Finch or someone like her, carrying linens and going about her life with a quiet efficiency that the entire population of Caldwell seemed constitutionally incapable of perceiving. It was not natural, and it was not right, and it bothered him in a way that went beyond mere curiosity. The following Wednesday, he made an excuse to ride into town on his own. He told the foreman, a weathered veteran of the cattle drives named Garrett Lomas, that he needed to speak to the farrier about Scout's shoes, which was true enough to serve. He found the farrier, dealt with the shoes, and then deliberately walked the length of the main street until he saw her. She was coming out of Mrs. Finch's laundry, which occupied the lower floor of a narrow white building on 2nd Street, with a bundle of wrapped garments under her arm. She was wearing the same deep brown calico from that first morning, with a clean white apron over it, and she was reading a small piece of paper that she held in her free hand, frowning slightly at it with the concentrated look of someone working through a list. Phineas crossed the street toward her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. She looked up from her paper, and again there was that small flicker of surprise, followed by the careful composure of someone who has learned to keep their reactions close to the chest. "Yes," she said. "I don't mean to be forward," he said, "and I know we haven't been introduced. My name is Phineas Reed. I work for the Hargrove Ranch, south of town. I believe I held the door for you at the general store last Tuesday, and I just wanted to make sure you'd found your way all right. It can be a confusing town when you're new to it." She looked at him for a moment with those steady gray eyes, measuring him in a way that was neither hostile nor flirtatious, but simply honest. She seemed to decide something. "Myrtle Lawson," she said. "And yes, thank you. I found Mrs. Finch's without too much difficulty. I've been here a week now and I'm beginning to learn the layout." "How are you finding it?" he asked. She glanced along the street. 2 men walked past them without a glance in her direction, though they nodded to Phineas. She watched them go, and her expression was quiet and careful in a way that told him she had grown used to exactly this kind of thing. "It's a decent enough town," she said. "The work is reliable, Mrs. Finch is fair." She paused. "It's a little solitary." "Solitary," he repeated. "People don't seem to notice me much," she said, with a directness that seemed to cost her something, a small admission of something she had perhaps been carrying alone. "I'm not sure why. I'm not particularly odd or frightening as far as I'm aware." "No," Phineas said, with a certainty that surprised even him. "You are not." She looked at him again with that same measuring quality, and this time the smallest fraction of a smile crossed her face. It was brief and genuine, and it did something entirely unreasonable to his pulse. "Well," she said, "I should get these back. Good day, Mr. Reed." "Good day, Miss Lawson." He watched her go. Scout, tied to a post nearby, turned his head and watched her go too, which was the most encouraging sign Phineas had received all week. He began to find reasons to come to town more often. He was not by nature a dishonest man, and he was aware that he was manufacturing excuses, but the excuses were not entirely false. There were always things needed from town, and Garrett Lomas never questioned him closely because Phineas's work was always done before he went anywhere. He had a good record and Garrett trusted him, which made the subterfuge feel less dishonest and more like a personal matter conducted on personal time. Over the following 2 weeks, he spoke to her 3 more times. Once outside the post office, where she had come to collect a letter that turned out to be from her younger sister in Wichita, which she tucked carefully into her apron pocket with a look of quiet relief. Once at the edge of the town well, where she was filling a bucket, and where he happened to be watering Scout, and where they talked for nearly 20 minutes about whether the summer would bring the kind of heat that killed cattle or merely the kind that killed patience, and about her previous life in Abilene, where she had worked as a seamstress before the shop that employed her had burned in an accidental fire the previous spring. And once, most significantly, in the early evening when he came to return a borrowed book to Harold Busby, and found her sitting on the bench outside the general store in the last amber light of the day, mending a shirt with small, precise stitches, entirely alone on a busy street where 5 other people were passing and none of them so much as glanced at her. He sat down on the bench beside her, not too close, and said, "You don't mind if I sit here a minute?" She glanced up. "No," she said. "I don't mind at all." He had started to bring her small things, not gifts exactly because that would have been presumptuous, but he had a habit of noticing. He noticed that she mentioned once that she couldn't find good thread in Caldwell, only the thin kind that broke easily on heavier fabric. And the next week, he brought a spool of proper heavy-duty thread from a dry goods in the neighboring town of Wellington, where he had ridden on ranch business. He left it at the laundry counter with his name on a folded piece of paper beside it. He noticed that she mentioned, with a wistfulness so brief and controlled that he almost missed it, that she used to take her noon meal outside in Abilene because there was a small park near the shop, and she missed having somewhere to eat in the open air. He mentioned the next time he saw her that there was a very pleasant spot on the north bank of Slate Creek, just at the edge of town, where there was a cottonwood tree that gave good shade, and that if she had her noon break on Thursday, he happened to know a path that went there directly. She had come on Thursday. He had brought food from the ranch kitchen, wrapped in cloth. They sat under the cottonwood tree in the noon light, with the creek moving softly past them, and ate cold cornbread and dried beef, and talked for the better part of an hour about things that mattered and things that did not. And somewhere in the middle of it all, between a conversation about her mother who had died 3 years prior of a fever, and his explanation of how cattle drives actually worked from the inside, the particular quality of the silence between them changed into something that was no longer the silence of two people who do not know each other well. It was the beginning of August when he first understood, with the full clarity of a man who does not lie to himself, that he was falling in love with her. He was out on the South Range, moving a herd of Hereford cattle toward water, and his mind drifted to her face when she laughed, which was not often but when it happened was entirely unguarded and lit her eyes in a way that made everything else in the vicinity seem temporarily less significant. He was so distracted by this recollection that he nearly missed the calf that had gotten itself stuck in a muddy creek bed. He pulled it out by hand, covered himself in mud to the elbows, and spent the ride back to the bunkhouse thinking that a reasonable man would bring this particular feeling under control before it made him dangerous. He was not particularly successful at bringing it under control. He asked her, on their 4th meeting at the cottonwood tree, whether she was happy in Caldwell or whether she intended to move on. He asked it carefully, as though the answer were merely a matter of practical curiosity, but he felt the question in his sternum when he asked it. She considered it seriously, the way she considered most things. She was not a woman who gave shallow answers. "I don't know yet," she said at last. "I came here because there was work and I needed work. I stayed because Mrs. Finch is kind and the work is steady. Whether I'm happy is a harder question." She looked at the creek. "I've been invisible most of my life, Mr. Reed, not just here. In Abilene, too. People look right through me as though I'm made of glass. I've never known why. I stopped expecting it to be different." She paused. "Until recently." The way she said it, quietly and without coyness, looking at the water rather than at him, told him everything he needed to know about the courage that small admission required. "I notice you," he said, and it came out more simply and more plainly than he had intended, stripped of all the careful architecture he might have built around it, just the bare truth of it, lying there between them in the warm August air. She turned and looked at him, and her gray eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was close to their origin. "I know," she said. "That is what I mean." They did not say anything else for a while, and the cottonwood tree stood above them, and the creek went on past them, and the afternoon went gold and then copper, and then the long Kansas twilight stretched out toward the horizon, and neither of them moved to leave. The trouble arrived in the form of a man named Walt Durbin. Walt Durbin was 37 years old, broad as a barn door, and had come to Caldwell 6 months prior from a cattle operation in Texas that had, by various accounts, ended badly, and through no fault anyone was willing to specify too clearly. He worked as a hired hand for a rancher named Culpepper, who owned land to the west of Hargroves, and he came to town most Saturdays and occasionally Tuesdays, and he drank whiskey at the saloon and played poker badly and was not a pleasant loser. He was not precisely dangerous, but he had a quality of restless aggression that made men measure their words around him, and women take a different street. The fact that Myrtle was invisible to most people in Caldwell did not, it turned out, apply universally. Walt Durbin could see her perfectly well. Phineas discovered this on a Tuesday morning in the middle of August, when he came to town for the weekly supply, and found Myrtle standing outside Mrs. Finch's laundry with her arms wrapped around herself in the posture of someone who has recently had an unpleasant conversation and is waiting for her heart to slow down. He was off his horse and beside her before he had quite decided to be. "What's the matter?" he asked. She looked up at him, and there was a mixture of irritation and discomfort on her face that she was working to smooth away with her usual composure. "Nothing that can't be managed," she said. "Myrtle," he said, and it was the first time he had used her Christian name, and they both noticed it but neither addressed it because there were more immediate things. She exhaled. "That large man from Culpepper's ranch, Durbin. He came by this morning with a load of shirts for pressing, and he said certain things while he was here that were not appropriate and that I made clear were not welcome. He left, but he didn't seem particularly discouraged." Phineas felt a specific and unhelpful kind of heat move through his chest. He kept his face very still. "Did he touch you?" he asked. "No," she said. "He was merely insistent and unpleasant, but he said he would be back on Thursday." "What did you say to that?" "I said I would have his shirts ready for collection on Thursday morning, as that is my job. I did not address the rest of what he implied." Phineas stood quietly for a moment, running through his options with the methodical care he applied to all significant decisions. He was not a man who looked for fights. He was also not a man who could reasonably stand by and do nothing. "I'd like to be here on Thursday," he said. "If that's all right with you." She looked at him carefully. "I don't need rescuing, Mr. Reed." "I know that," he said. "I'm not offering to rescue you. I'm asking if you'd like company." The distinction was enough. She considered it. "That would be fine," she said at last. "And his name is Phineas, isn't it? I've been calling you Mr. Reed for 3 weeks." "It is," he said. "Then Phineas," she said, and the way she said it, testing the shape of it in her mouth, made the morning feel considerably brighter than it had been a moment before. He arranged things with Garrett on Thursday morning so that he could ride into town before noon. He was waiting outside the laundry at 10:30 when Walt Durbin arrived on a brown horse, dismounted with the heavy carelessness of a large man who has never had to be careful, and came up the boardwalk carrying the expectant swagger of someone who expects things to go his way. He stopped when he saw Phineas. Phineas was leaning against the wall beside the laundry door with his arms folded, not blocking the entrance, not making a scene, simply present in the particular way that communicates to a certain kind of man that this territory has already been accounted for. He looked at Durbin with the level, unhurried regard of someone who is not afraid and is not angry but simply intends to stand there for as long as necessary. Durbin's eyes narrowed. "Reed," he said. "Durbin," Phineas replied. "You picking up your washing?" "Waiting for a friend," Phineas said pleasantly. Durbin looked at the door and back at Phineas. He was weighing something behind his eyes, the calculation of a man who picks his encounters based on the cost-benefit arithmetic of pride versus consequence. "A friend," Durbin repeated, with a certain contempt in the word. "That's right." Durbin spat in the dirt beside the boardwalk, which was the kind of thing men did in lieu of saying what they actually meant. Then he went inside. Phineas heard, through the thin walls, the brief exchange of a business transaction, shirts received and payment made, nothing more. When Durbin came back out, he paused and looked at Phineas again. "She working for you now?" he asked. "She's her own person," Phineas said without inflection. "She always has been." Durbin held his gaze for a moment longer, then made the calculation and walked back to his horse. He rode south without looking back. Phineas waited until he was out of sight and then went inside. Myrtle was at the pressing board at the back of the shop, running the iron over a length of cotton, and she looked up when the door opened. Something in her shoulders released when she saw it was him. "He was civil," she said. "He was," Phineas agreed. "Thank you," she said. "He won't be a problem," Phineas said, and believed it. He was right, as it turned out. Durbin moved on to a new operation in the Indian Territory before September was out, which settled that particular matter in the way that Western towns often settled things, through attrition and relocation. But what had begun between them under the weight of that situation continued to grow through the remainder of August and into the long, warm September of 1878, which was the most beautiful autumn Phineas could remember seeing in Kansas, the prairie going gold and russet under a sky so blue it looked painted, the nights crisp and full of stars, the air carrying the scent of dry grass and wood smoke that has always been the particular perfume of the plains in autumn. They had a routine by now. He came to town twice a week on ranch business that was partially invented and partially real, and they met at the cottonwood tree by Slate Creek when her noon break allowed it. And sometimes in the evenings he came in on his own time and walked with her along the quieter streets of town while the light faded, and the lamplighters made their rounds, and the saloon up on First Street began to warm with noise and music that drifted to them faintly on the night air. She told him things. Not all at once, because she was not that kind of woman, but piece by piece, the way a house is built, one solid thing laid on top of another until it becomes something you can live in. She told him about her father, who had been a school teacher in Missouri before they had moved to Kansas when she was 12, and who had been a quiet, bookish man who loved her very much and died of influenza when she was 19. She told him about her sister Clara in Wichita, 3 years younger, recently married to a dry goods merchant named Thomas, who was apparently a good man and very fond of his own opinions. She told him about the fire in Abilene, how she had arrived at the shop one morning to find it a blackened skeleton against the morning sky, all her work inside it, the bolt of silk she had been saving to make into something beautiful one day, gone. She told him these things in the direct, unsentimental way that people speak when they have processed grief and are reporting facts rather than seeking comfort. But he heard the feeling beneath the facts and kept it in the careful place where he kept all important things. He told her things in return. His mother, still living in Independence, Missouri, a woman of formidable opinions and extraordinary biscuits. His father, a farmer who had drunk too much and worked hard despite it, and died at 49 of a heart that had finally objected to both habits simultaneously. The cattle drive he had worked when he was 22, riding the Kishom Trail from Texas to Abilene for the first time, the particular violence of that summer, a storm that killed 4 cattle and nearly killed a man named Orville Dawes who survived on account of stubbornness and a very good horse. The reason he had come to Caldwell, which was that Hargrove had hired him for his reputation as a good hand with difficult cattle, and he had come because he was tired of drifting and Caldwell had felt, for some reason he could not entirely articulate, like a place worth stopping. And was it? She asked one evening as they stood at the edge of the creek in the last of the September light, the water dark and quiet between its banks. Worth stopping? He looked at her, and the evening light was in her hair where a strand had come loose from her pins and curved against her cheek, and her gray eyes were warm and waiting, and he thought that he had stopped in Caldwell 3 years ago, and now he understood why. "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment with a searching quality that was different from her usual measuring regard. This was something more personal, more exposed. "Phineas," she said. "Yes. Why can you see me?" It was the question she had been carrying since the beginning, he could see that. The fundamental mystery of her life in Caldwell, this inexplicable invisibility that the entire town seemed to share except for the one man who had stood on a boardwalk 3 months ago and could not take his eyes away. He thought about it seriously because she deserved a serious answer. "I don't know," he said at last, honestly. "I've thought about it. I've watched it happen, watched people walk right past you as though you aren't there, and I can't explain it. All I know is that when I look at you, I can see everything." He paused. "Every single thing." She was quiet for a moment. The creek moved past them. A nighthawk called somewhere overhead. "It was like that before Caldwell, too," she said. "In Abilene, in Missouri, growing up, I used to think there was something wrong with me, something that made me beneath notice. Not unpleasant or repellent, just insufficient, not enough to hold attention." Her voice was very careful and very controlled. "My mother could see me, of course, and my father, and Clara. But outside the family, people looked through me the way you look through a window. I was there but not there. You are here," he said. "You are absolutely, completely here." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him. And they stood there in the gathering dark by the creek with their hands folded together like something that had always been meant to fit that way. She looked down at their hands and then up at his face, and the composure she always carried so carefully cracked just slightly. And he saw underneath it the full weight of what it costs a person to go through life unacknowledged, to be present and capable and worthy and simply not seen, day after day, year after year. "You are worth seeing," he said. "You are worth more than this whole town could see if they looked all at once." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, and she turned her face away toward the creek, and he stood quietly beside her and held her hand and let her have whatever she needed to have in the space of that moment. After a while she squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." "I know you do," she said. "That is why I'm thanking you." October came in with a cold wind off the plains, and the cottonwood tree lost its leaves in a single dramatic week, dropping them in drifts of yellow along the creek bank. Phineas and Myrtle shifted their meetings to the warmer indoors of the general store's back room, where Harold Busby had set up a small table for customers who needed to read correspondence or wait for orders to be filled, and where Harold himself continued to be cheerfully oblivious to Myrtle's presence while simultaneously providing tea without being asked, which was a contradiction that neither of them bothered to examine too closely. The other ranch hands had noticed that Phineas was going to town more often, and Dub Carver in particular had made several pointed remarks about whether the farrier was charging him extra for the frequency of Scout shoe inspections, which had caused laughter in the bunkhouse and a good-humored obscenity from Phineas in return. He had not told them about Myrtle, partly because he was private by nature and partly because he was not yet sure how to explain a woman that no one else could see without sounding like he had been spending too much time alone on the prairie. It was Eli Stamp who finally asked him directly, one October evening when the two of them were the last ones awake in the bunkhouse, Eli reading one of his Ohio newspapers that arrived 3 weeks late and Phineas sitting with his coffee and his thoughts. "There's a woman in town," Eli said, not looking up from his paper. Phineas looked at him. "There are several women in town," he said. "One in particular," Eli said. "You go to see her." Phineas was quiet for a moment. "Is it that obvious?" He said. "Only to me," Eli said. "Dub thinks it's the farrier, but I've seen you on Tuesdays. You ride in looking like a man with a purpose and you come back looking like a man who's had a conversation worth having. That's different from farrier's work." He turned a page. "What's her name?" "Myrtle Lawson," Phineas said. "She works at Mrs. Finch's laundry." "Is she good?" Eli asked and meant it in the right way. "She is the best person I know," Phineas said, which surprised him with its own certainty. Eli nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then you should do something about it," he said, and returned to his newspaper. It was simpler than Phineas had expected, being told what he already knew. He thought about how to do it properly, because Myrtle Lawson was not a woman to be approached carelessly, and he had a clear sense that she would not respect a man who did this wrong. He was not afraid of her exactly, but he was deeply and appropriately in awe of her, and he wanted to meet that with something equal to it. He thought about it for 2 weeks, turning it over, considering it from different angles the way you consider a piece of land before you decide to build on it. He went to town on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, leaving early enough that he arrived before she had started her noon break. He went to the laundry, knocked on the door, and when she opened it he was standing there with his hat in his hands and the full October sky behind him, and he said, "I'd like to speak with you when you have time if you're willing. Not at the creek, somewhere warmer, maybe this evening." She looked at him with those gray eyes that saw everything, and she said yes. She had a small room above the laundry, rented from Mrs. Finch, a narrow, neat space with a window that looked east toward the creek, and a small iron stove that she kept going through the cold nights. She had made it unmistakably hers in the way that people do when they are accustomed to moving around, and have learned to put their mark on a space quickly. A dried flower from some previous place pinned above the window, a small framed likeness of her parents on the narrow shelf, a stack of books from the lending library that Harold Busby maintained with cheerful disorder in a corner of the general store. He had not been in the room before, and it told him things about her that made him love her more, which he had not thought was the current direction available to the situation. She made tea on the iron stove because she had a small kettle and a tin of tea leaves that were clearly precious, and she set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him with her hands folded and her full attention on him, and he said what he had come to say. "I have been coming to town on pretext for 3 months," he said. "You know that. You're not a person who misses things. I've been coming because I wanted to see you, and each time I see you the wanting is stronger than the time before, and I'm not willing to keep pretending it's about rope and cinch straps." He looked at her steadily. "I would like to court you properly, Myrtle, if that's something you're willing to consider. I'm not a wealthy man. I have a good reputation, a sound horse, 4 months' wages saved, and the absolute certain knowledge that I have never in my life looked at another person the way I look at you." The room was very quiet except for the small sound of the stove, and distantly, the evening life of the town outside. She looked at him across the table with the full gravity of someone who has been given something they did not expect to receive, and is determining whether it is safe to believe in it. "You've thought about this," she said. "For some time," he said. "You're not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I try not to be." She looked down at her tea and then back up at him, and the care she always kept in her face had eased into something more open, something that was the closest he had seen to the undefended truth of her. "I have been invisible my whole life," she said quietly. "That does something to a person, Phineas. It makes you careful about believing you're worth someone's attention, because the evidence has mostly pointed the other way. And I don't want to make decisions based on the simple relief of being noticed. I want to make them based on the right things." "That's fair," he said. "I think you are a good man," she said. "I think you are honest and steady and kind in a way that doesn't make a performance of itself, which is the best kind of kindness. And I think that what I feel when I'm with you is different from anything I've felt before." She paused. "I would like you to court me." He felt the whole evening shift slightly, the way the atmosphere changes before good weather arrives. "Then I will," he said. She smiled at him, and it was not the brief, careful smile she usually allowed herself, but something fuller and more real, and it reached her eyes and made them brilliant with it. And he sat in her small, warm room with his tea cooling in his hands, and thought that he was the luckiest man in the state of Kansas, and possibly beyond. The courtship of Myrtle Lawson and Phineas Reed in the autumn and early winter of 1878 was conducted with a deliberateness and a warmth that pleased them both enormously. He came to town on Sundays, his official day off, and they walked together after the church service that she attended, and he had started attending primarily because it meant arriving at the church door at the same moment she did and walking in beside her and sitting in the same pew, which caused absolutely no comment from anyone. because most of the congregation continued to display the same inexplicable blindness to her that the rest of the town maintained. The preacher, a lean and energetic man named Reverend Chalk, greeted Phineas warmly every week and managed to look right through Myrtle while doing so, which Phineas had long since stopped expecting to understand and had simply begun to factor in as a constant. After church, they walked south along 2nd Street to the creek, even in the cold, wrapped in coats, and talked for as long as the weather permitted. In November, they graduated to Saturday evenings in her room, with her cooking something simple on the iron stove, cornmeal mush or bean soup, or the particular kind of pan cornbread she had learned from her mother that was dense and sweet, and disappeared faster than anything else she made. He brought things when he could. Dried apples from a barrel at the general store. A new book from Harold Busby's lending library, a novel by Mr. Dickens that she read with an intensity that made him happy just to watch. Once, extravagantly, a small jar of good honey from a beekeeper in Wellington, which she received with the kind of quiet pleasure that is more satisfying to give than any louder response would have been. He wrote to his mother in Independence. He told her about Myrtle in the careful way, "A man writes about a woman when the feeling is serious, and he wants the description to be accurate." He said she was a seamstress, that she was intelligent and principled, and had gray eyes and a sense of humor that was dry and observational and arrived unexpectedly, and that she had been through difficulties that had not diminished her. His mother wrote back within 2 weeks, which was fast by the standards of the mail in 1878, and said that she sounded wonderful and that she hoped he would do the honorable thing at the appropriate time and not linger about it unnecessarily, as lingering was a bad habit he had inherited from his father. Phineas read this letter twice and then wrote back saying he intended to do exactly that. Myrtle wrote to Clara in Wichita. Clara wrote back with an enthusiasm that was typical of Clara, full of exclamation and advice, and a spirited request that Myrtle bring this Phineas Reed to Wichita at the earliest possible occasion, so that Clara and Thomas could form their own opinions. Myrtle read this letter to Phineas on a Saturday evening in late November, sitting at her small table while the wind pressed against the window and the stove breathed warmth into the room, and she read it with a smile that she was making only a moderate effort to suppress, and when she finished reading she looked at him and said, "She'll terrify you." "Probably," he agreed comfortably. "You're not bothered. I think anyone who loves you that much is someone I'm going to get along with," he said. She looked at him with that expression that had become one of his favorite things on earth, the particular softened quality of her face when he said something that reached through her composure and arrived at the real her underneath. "You are remarkably good at this," she said. "At what?" "At saying exactly the right thing." "I don't try to," he said. "I just say what's true." "That," she said, "is what makes it remarkable." It was December when he asked her. He had planned it carefully, because she deserved careful planning. He had spoken to Reverend Chalk, who had reacted with a blank politeness that confirmed he had no idea who Myrtle Lawson was. He had spoken to Mrs. Finch, who had at least the distinction of being able to see Myrtle in the limited context of their employer-employee relationship, and who had given him a brisk and decisive approval that came with the caveat that she would need 3 weeks' notice if Myrtle was to leave the laundry, which he thought was probably not what etiquette required from a landlady receiving a marriage proposal on behalf of a tenant, but which he appreciated for its practicality. He had also, and this was the part that had cost him the most deliberation, written to Clara in Wichita, explaining his intentions and asking in the spirit of family custom whether she had any objection. Clara had written back by return mail, and her letter, which was considerably more effusive than any letter he had received in his life, concluded with the words, "If you make my sister happy, I will consider you the finest man in Kansas, and if you don't I will hold that opinion permanently in reserve," which he had found admirable. He had also, and this had required the most specific and patient labor, found a ring. It was not an expensive ring, because he was a ranch hand, and his savings were honest but modest. But he had found a silversmith in Wellington who could set a small turquoise stone in a simple silver band, and the turquoise was the same quiet gray-blue as the Kansas sky on a clear morning. And when he held it in his palm in the silversmith's small shop, he had thought that it looked like something that had been made for her. He had it in his coat pocket on the Sunday evening of December the 15th, 1878, when he walked from the Hargrove Ranch to Caldwell in the cold, clear dark, because he had given Scout the day off, and because the walk seemed appropriate. The stars were extraordinary over the plains, the kind of sky that Kansas gives you in December, sharp and brilliant and vast, and he walked the 5 miles with his breath making small clouds in the air and the ring safe in his pocket, and his mind entirely clear of everything except the simple intention of what he was about to do. She was in her room when he knocked, reading by lamplight, wrapped in a wool shawl against the cold that the iron stove could only partly defeat. She looked surprised to see him on a Sunday evening rather than the morning, and then she looked at his face, and something in her attention shifted, becoming very still and very focused. He came inside and he sat down at the table and she sat across from him, and he reached into his coat pocket and he put the ring on the table between them and he looked at her and said, "Myrtle, I want to marry you. I want to be the person who sees you every day for all the days there are. I want to build something with you, something real and lasting, and I want to do it here, or somewhere else if you prefer, or anywhere at all, because the geography is not the point. The point is you, and the point is me, and the point is that I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am of this." She looked at the ring on the table, and then she looked at him, and her gray eyes were bright with the specific brightness of someone who has been waiting for something they were afraid to want and has just been given it, whole and genuine and freely. "Yes," she said, and her voice was very steady but her hands were not, when she reached across the table and picked up the ring. "Yes, Phineas." He was off his chair and around the table before he had properly thought about it, and he took the ring from her and slid it onto her finger, which was the right size exactly because he had thought carefully about these things. And she stood up from her chair, and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the small warm room with the lamp burning and the wind outside and the whole winter plains around them. And he held her, and she held him, and that was where the rest of their lives began. They were married on the 12th of February, 1879, in the Caldwell Methodist Church by Reverend Chalk, who presided over the ceremony with his usual warm opacity, seemingly unaware throughout that the bride was the most extraordinary person in the room. Clara and her husband Thomas came by train from Wichita, Clara in a blue dress that she had clearly spent considerable effort on, and Thomas in a suit that appeared to have been selected under duress. Phineas's mother, Margaret Reed, came all the way from Independence, Missouri, 3 days by stage, and arrived with the energy of a woman half her age and strong opinions about the quality of Kansas flour. Eli Stamp came and sat in the second pew and cried quietly in the way of men who will deny having done so afterward. Dub Carver came and did not cry, but did shake Phineas's hand for a very long time and say, "I still don't rightly know where she came from, but I'm glad she got here," which Phineas decided to receive as a blessing. The ceremony was simple and real. When Reverend Chalk asked whether anyone present had reason to object to the union, the church was absolutely silent, which felt appropriate. Phineas and Myrtle spoke their vows to each other with the quiet certainty of people who mean what they say and have thought about what they are saying. And when the Reverend pronounced them married and Phineas kissed his bride, Clara made a sound that was clearly an attempt at a discreet emotional noise and entirely failed to be discreet, which made Myrtle laugh against Phineas's mouth, which was possibly the best moment of the ceremony. After the wedding, they had a small dinner at the Caldwell Hotel's private dining room, which Harold Busby had arranged with his usual cheerful efficiency, despite apparently having no concrete idea that a wedding had taken place. Margaret Reed and Clara took to each other with an immediate enthusiasm that was slightly alarming for everyone around them, and Thomas shook Phineas's hand repeatedly and said, "She's been waiting for the right man, and I'm very glad you turned out to be him," in a tone that suggested he had rehearsed this and was relieved to have delivered it without error. That evening, after the guests had retired and the hotel was quiet, Phineas and Myrtle sat together in the room they had taken for the night, the lamplight warm and the plains outside frozen and brilliant with stars, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they were quiet in the particular way that is full rather than empty. And he thought about the boardwalk in July, and the first morning she had walked into town, and the whole town had looked right through her, and how he had been rooted to that boardwalk like a man who had just understood something essential about the nature of the world, and he thought that every step he had taken since then had led here, to this room, to this woman, to this silence that was so full of living. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am the luckiest man on the Kansas plains," he said. She tilted her head and looked at him, and her ring caught the lamplight. "I think you are the only man who ever looked at me," she said softly. "Then the rest of them were blind," he said. "Yes," she said, "they were." They settled at the Hargrove Ranch initially, because Garrett Lomas had offered them the use of a small foreman's cottage that had stood empty for 2 seasons at the eastern edge of the ranch property, a solid 2-room structure with a proper stone fireplace and windows that faced east toward the creek. It was small but good, and Myrtle set to making it theirs with the same efficient purpose she brought to everything. Curtains she sewed herself from fabric Clara sent from Wichita, a braided rug for the sitting room floor, her parents' photograph above the fireplace, Phineas's mother's recipe for cornbread written on a piece of card and tucked to the kitchen wall. She continued working for Mrs. Finch 3 days a week, because she liked working and she was skilled at it, and because the income added to theirs in ways that mattered as they began to save for their own land. Phineas worked the ranch with the same reliability he had always brought to it, and Garrett, who had watched the transformation of his best hand into a man with a real reason to come home at the end of the day, gave him a raise in March that was not discussed and not negotiated, but simply appeared in his pay envelope with a nod from Garrett that communicated everything necessary. Their life together was not without difficulty, because lives together never are. There were months when the cattle market was poor and money was tight, and they ate more beans and less beef. There was a week in April when a spring storm brought water into the cottage through a weakness in the roof that Phineas fixed with shingles and stubbornness, spending 2 full days in the cold rain until it was right. There was an ongoing conversation about whether to stay in Caldwell or whether to look for land elsewhere, which was never fully resolved, but was always revisited with the particular energy that comes from 2 people who are serious about building something real. But there was also the slow accumulation of the good things. The mornings when she woke before him and had coffee made by the time he came to the kitchen table, and she handed him his cup without speaking because she knew he needed a few minutes of silence before the day began, which was a consideration so accurate and so unasked for that it unmanned him slightly every time. The evenings when she read to him from the Dickens novel, and then from Mr. Twain, and then from whatever Harold Busby had recently received at the lending library, her voice clear in the fire-lit room while outside the plains wind moved through the grass. The Sundays when they rode double on Scout to the creek and walked along the bank where the cottonwood tree stood leafless through winter, and then put on its first pale green in April and was magnificent by June, and she gathered wildflowers along the bank, and he carried them home for her because his hands were bigger. In the spring of 1879, something shifted in the town's relationship to Myrtle, and it happened so gradually that neither of them could point to the moment it began. It started with Mrs. Harrington, the wife of the town's doctor, who came into the laundry one Wednesday and looked at Myrtle directly when she asked about the presswork, and then said, "You're the Reed woman, aren't you? I've been meaning to call on you." This was so unexpected that Myrtle stood very still for a moment before responding. Mrs. Harrington had her to tea the following Friday, and 2 other wives of the town were there, and they talked for 2 hours, and Myrtle came home that evening with a brightness about her that Phineas recognized as the specific brightness of someone who has been seen. It did not happen all at once, and it never became universal. There would always be people in Caldwell who looked right through her, who passed her on the street without recognition, who heard her voice in a room and seemed to process it as ambient sound. But there were more and more people who could see her, and Phineas thought sometimes that it was like watching a window become gradually less fogged, the same view slowly resolving into clarity. He asked her once if she understood it, this fading of the invisibility. "I've thought about it," she said carefully, as she always did when the question was worth thinking about. "I think perhaps it has something to do with belonging. When I came here I had no root, no connection to the place. I was passing through, or might have been, and people without knowing they're doing it look past things that might not stay." She paused, turning her ring on her finger, which was a small habit he had noticed and loved. "Now I belong here. I have you and the cottage and Mrs. Finch's and Clara's letters and the creek and the cottonwood tree. I have a life here that is real and rooted, and perhaps that makes me more visible." She looked at him. "Or perhaps the only thing that was ever keeping me invisible was that I didn't believe myself worth seeing, and you changed that." He did not say anything because the moment did not need words, but he took her hand across the table and held it in both of his, and she let him. And the kitchen was warm, and the plains outside were going green with the first real color of summer. It was in June of 1879 that Myrtle told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning, before he went out to work, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in the way she had when she was being deliberately calm about something large. He had not been expecting it, though he had been hoping, and the information hit him in the chest like something warm and enormous, and it took him a moment to organize himself around it. "You're sure?" he said. "Mrs. Harrington confirmed it 2 days ago," she said, watching him with those steady gray eyes that were waiting to see how he received this. He pushed back his chair and came around the table and pulled her up from her chair and held her, and she put her arms around him and her face against his chest, and he could feel her exhale the tension she had been carrying with the telling of it. "We're going to need more room," he said into her hair. She laughed, which was the exact sound he had been hoping to produce. "We have some months to manage that," she said. He spoke to Garrett Lomas that afternoon. Garrett, who had 3 children of his own and a wife who had grown up in this country, and had opinions on everything related to ranch life, listened to Phineas's situation with his hands on his hips, and then said that it happened he knew of 40 acres that had come available 3 miles east of the ranch, along a better stretch of the creek, with a house already on it that needed work but was structurally sound. The previous owner, an elderly man named Breckenridge, had gone to live with his son in Missouri and had left the property in Garrett's informal care until a suitable buyer could be found. Garrett thought the price was within reach if Phineas had his savings and could negotiate the rest on reasonable terms, and he knew for a fact that Breckenridge's son was more interested in settling the property than in extracting a fortune from it. Phineas went to see the land the next day. He rode Scout along the creek trail and came up over a low rise and saw it, 40 acres of good flat land running down to the creek. The house, a 2-story white frame structure that had weathered but not surrendered, a solid barn beside it, an apple tree in what had been a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat wild but was clearly still producing. He sat on Scout for a long moment looking at it, and then he rode home and brought Myrtle back the next afternoon, and she stood at the top of the rise and looked at it in the golden afternoon light, and he stood beside her and watched her face. She was quiet for a long time. "There's room enough," she said at last. "Room enough for what?" She looked at him with the beginnings of a smile. "For everything we're going to build." They bought the property in August of 1879, using 4 months of combined savings and a note to Breckenridge's son that Phineas intended to honor before the year was out. He spent the remainder of that summer and the early autumn making the house livable with the help of Eli Stamp, who turned out to be a surprisingly gifted carpenter, and Dub Carver, who was not particularly gifted but was enormous and could lift structural beams that required 3 normal men. The house was sound by September, cleaned and repaired and fitted with the furniture they had accumulated between them. Myrtle's curtains in the windows and her braided rug in the sitting room, and the fireplace cleaned of a decade of birds' nests, and crackling properly by the time October brought the first real cold. Their son was born on the 22nd of November, 1879, in the upstairs bedroom of the new house, attended by Mrs. Harrington, and with Phineas in the hall outside because that was where Mrs. Harrington said he should be, though he would have preferred to be considerably closer. The labor was long, and Phineas spent 9 hours sitting in the hall drinking coffee that Eli Stamp kept bringing him from the kitchen, listening to the sounds from the bedroom with the concentrated attention of a man who has no ability to help and finds this state of affairs entirely intolerable. When Mrs. Harrington opened the door and told him he could come in, he was inside before she had finished the sentence. Myrtle was sitting up in the bed, exhausted and flushed and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, with a bundle of blanket in her arms from which emerged the most important noise he had ever heard in his life, a small, insistent, absolutely certain cry. "Come and see your son," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the bundle in his arms and he looked down at the face of his child, red and wrinkled and fiercely present, and he felt something open in him that he had not known was closed. "He's perfect," he said. "He looks like a turnip," Myrtle said, and laughed the tired, genuine laugh of someone who has been through the most significant physical experience of her life and has come through it intact and is profoundly relieved to find the world still funny. "A perfect turnip," Phineas said. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had talked about names. He had a thought. "Joseph," he said, "for your father." She was quiet. He looked up from the baby at her face and saw the full weight of that move through her, the recognition and the gratitude and the grief for her father who was not here to see this, all arriving at once and passing through her like weather. "Yes," she said softly. "Joseph." Clara and Thomas came from Wichita for the Christmas of 1879, traveling by stage on roads that were frozen solid and rough as broken crockery, arriving at the farmhouse door with luggage and cold cheeks and gifts, and Clara went directly to the baby and did not put him down for 3 hours, which Thomas bore with philosophical patience. Margaret Reed came from Independence and installed herself in the guest room, and made her opinions about the proper way to produce good broth available to anyone within earshot, and Myrtle received these opinions with a grace that Phineas privately considered heroic. The house was full in a way it had never been before, and Phineas stood in the kitchen doorway on Christmas evening with Joseph asleep in the crook of his arm, looking into the sitting room where Myrtle and Clara were talking with their heads bent together over something, their voices low and amused, Clara's hand on Myrtle's arm, and his mother in the corner chair telling Eli Stamp, who had been invited because he had nowhere else to go, about the proper management of a kitchen garden in Missouri, which Eli was receiving with the expression of a man who did not particularly need this information, but recognized that it was being given in a spirit of genuine generosity. He thought about Caldwell. He thought about that first Tuesday morning when she had walked across the street and not a soul had turned to look at her. He thought about the 30 seconds on that boardwalk when he had understood that something was wrong with the world and that he was apparently alone in understanding it. He thought that perhaps the world was not wrong, not exactly. Perhaps the world had simply not been paying attention. And he had been paying attention his entire life, carefully and consistently, to the things that mattered, and the most important thing he had ever paid attention to was a woman in a frayed-ribbon bonnet crossing a dusty street in Caldwell in the summer of 1878, carrying everything she owned in 2 bags, and walking forward into a life that was about to change entirely, though she did not yet know it. He looked down at Joseph, who made a small sleeping sound and curled his fist tighter in his sleep. "Good," Phineas said quietly to him, meaning everything. The years that followed were the kind of years that do not make dramatic stories but make excellent lives. The farm grew in the careful, incremental way that real farms grow. A new fence line one spring, an extension on the barn the next, a proper kitchen garden in the 3rd year that Myrtle tended with an absorption that was unmistakably pleasure. The apple tree in the original kitchen garden was pruned and coaxed back to full production, and in the autumn of 1881, it gave them enough apples that Myrtle spent 2 consecutive weekends making preserves with Mrs. Harrington and a neighbor woman named Sally Booth, who had moved to the area from Colorado the previous year, and who could see Myrtle perfectly clearly from the first moment and became her closest friend. Sally Booth was 30 years old, brown-haired and sharp-tongued and funny, the widow of a rancher who had died of a rattlesnake bite, which she described with a matter-of-factness that concealed the fact that she had loved him very much. She appeared one afternoon at the farmhouse door, having ridden over from her property 2 miles east, to return a pan she had borrowed from Mrs. Harrington and been told to deliver here because Mrs. Harrington had subsequently developed a cold. She stood on the porch and held out the pan and said, "I'm Sally Booth, and I have your neighbor's pan, and she says you have preserving jars she needs borrowed back for winter pressing." Myrtle looked at her for a moment. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." That had been the beginning of a friendship that took the same form as all good friendships do. That is to say, it was made of specifics rather than generalities, of the particular conversations that happen when 2 women sit across a kitchen table from each other and are honest, of the shared labor of preserving and mending and managing land and raising children, of the kind of laughter that happens when 2 people find the same things genuinely funny and don't need to explain why. Joseph Reed grew up healthy and strong, and with his father's green eyes and his mother's quiet, focused intelligence, which combination made him the sort of child who observed everything, said less than he knew, and occasionally arrived at conclusions that were several steps ahead of where the adults around him thought he was. By the time he was 2 years old, he had a clear preference for the horses and a vocabulary that Myrtle tracked with a seamstress's precision for detail. By the time he was 3, he was following Phineas around the farm with the absolute devotion of a son who has decided his father is the most interesting person in the world, which Phineas found both moving and occasionally inconvenient, since it meant having an earnest small shadow during every task, including the ones that required careful attention. In the spring of 1882, Myrtle told him she was expecting again. This time he was not caught off guard. He had been hoping for it, and she had been hoping for it, and when she told him across the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in April with Joseph asleep upstairs, they were both smiling before she had finished the sentence. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "Joseph will have to share Scout," he said. "Scout is not Joseph's horse," she said, with the firmness that meant she was actually laughing. "Tell him that," Phineas said. Their daughter arrived in November of 1882 as storms were rolling across the plains and the creek behind the house was running high and silver with rain. They named her Margaret Grace, Margaret for Phineas's mother and Grace, because Myrtle said that was what she had felt every day of her life since July of 1878, which was not a statement Phineas could hear without having to take a moment before responding. Joseph, who was 3 years old and had been told in careful terms about what was happening, stood beside the bed after Mrs. Harrington had cleaned things up and looked at his sister with the expression of a person confronting a fact that is interesting but unclear in its implications. "Is she going to stay?" he asked. "She is going to stay," Myrtle confirmed. "All right," Joseph said, with the air of someone making a fair-minded concession, and that was his welcome speech to Margaret Grace Reed. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was cold in the way that Kansas winters are cold when they mean it. The kind of cold that gets into the bones of the house and tests every sealed window and banked fire. Phineas kept the animals alive with a stubbornness equal to the weather's, and Myrtle kept the house warm and the family fed and Margaret Grace healthy, which was its own full-time occupation. Clara came in December, as she always did now, and this time brought the news that she was expecting herself, which she delivered to Myrtle in the kitchen with the contained joy of a woman who has wanted something for a long time and is almost afraid to believe she has it. Myrtle held her sister's hands across the table, and the two of them were quiet for a moment in a way that said everything the occasion required. The spring came eventually, as Kansas springs always do, with a violence of green that seems out of proportion to everything that preceded it, the land going from brown to brilliant in the space of a week, the creek flooding its banks briefly, and then settling back into its usual thoughtful progress, the apple tree putting on its blossoms in a burst of white that scattered in the wind and settled across the kitchen garden like early snow. Phineas expanded the cattle herd in March, buying 10 Hereford cows from Garrett Lomas, who was gradually winding down his operation in preparation for retirement. And by the summer of 1883, the Reed farm had a modest but genuine herd, and a reputation for well-managed stock that brought inquiries from 2 neighboring ranchers. He had not expected to become a man of property. He had not, if he was honest, expected very much of a future when he had been riding the drives and drifting through Kansas, finding good work and honest living, but nothing that felt like it had a center. Myrtle had given him a center. He thought about this sometimes in the quiet way that men think about the essential things of their lives, not often or loudly, but with a depth that is proportional to the importance of the subject. He thought about it one evening in the summer of 1883, a warm July evening with the prairie going gold and Joseph running through the kitchen garden chasing a dog they had acquired from the Booth property, a mixed-breed creature of no particular distinction and considerable affection, and Margaret Grace sitting on a blanket in the yard learning the grass with her hands, and Myrtle on the porch steps with her mending in her lap and the last light of the day in her face. And the whole of his life arranged around him in the evening air, and he came up onto the porch and sat down beside her, and she looked up from her mending and smiled at him, and it was the full smile, the one that reached her eyes and made everything in the vicinity temporarily less significant. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "About that boardwalk," he said. She tilted her head. "The first day." "Yes." She turned to look at the yard, at Joseph and the dog in the garden, at Margaret Grace on her blanket. "I think about it too," she said. "Sometimes I try to imagine what would have happened if you hadn't been standing on that boardwalk, if you'd been out on the range that day, or in the far pasture, or anywhere else." She was quiet for a moment. "I might have come and gone from Caldwell and never found any of this." "You would have found it somewhere," he said. "You would have found someone." She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "I don't think so. I think what you gave me was too specific to you. The particular way you see, the particular way you stayed." She looked at him. "I was invisible to everyone, Phineas, everyone except you. And I don't believe that was coincidence. I believe you looked because you were the kind of man who looks at what the world forgets to look at." He did not know what to say to that, because it was one of those things she said sometimes that went all the way through him and left him rearranged. He put his arm around her and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and Joseph shouted something triumphant in the garden, and the dog barked, and Margaret Grace laughed the unsteady, exuberant laugh of a 1-year-old who has found a piece of grass particularly interesting, and the Kansas summer evening went long and warm and golden all the way to the horizon. In the autumn of 1883, Sally Booth remarried. The man in question was a cattleman from Colorado named Art Dooley, 40 years old and sun-weathered, and clearly enormously taken with Sally in a way he managed to express primarily through practical actions. showing up at her property to fix fences and replace her roof shingles without being asked, which Sally received with a mixture of appreciation and irony that was distinctly her own. They married in October, a small ceremony at the Caldwell church, and Myrtle stood up with her as witness, and Phineas stood with Art, and afterward they all had dinner at the Dooley property, which Sally was already in the process of reorganizing to her own satisfaction. And the evening was long and good and full of the particular pleasure of watching two people who have both been alone for a while find their way to each other. Riding home in the dark afterward, with Myrtle beside him on the wagon seat and the children asleep in the wagon bed under blankets, she put her hand on his arm and said, "Do you know what I love most about this life?" "Tell me," he said. "That it keeps getting better," she said. "I thought when we married that was the best it would be, and then Joseph came and it was better, and then the farm and then Margaret Grace, and Sally and Mrs. Harrington and the apple tree. All of it keeps getting better." She paused. "I spent so many years invisible and alone, and I thought that was simply the condition of my life, that some people are just not built for being seen or loved, and I was wrong. I was so wrong." He covered her hand on his arm with his. "You were never invisible to yourself," he said. "No," she said slowly. "That's true. I always knew I was there. I just needed someone else to confirm it." "I will confirm it every day," he said, "for the rest of my life." She leaned against his shoulder, and the wagon rolled through the dark Kansas night, and the stars were very bright overhead, and the children breathed their deep, even sleep behind them, and Scout moved along the familiar road with the sure, unhurried pace of a horse that knows exactly where home is. Caldwell changed over the following years, as all Western towns did in that era. The cattle drives became less frequent as the railroads extended their reach and ranching practices changed. The town built a proper schoolhouse in 1884, a frame building on 3rd Street with 6 windows and a bell, and Myrtle became one of the founding members of the school committee, which was the first civic organization in Caldwell that regarded her as a member without reservation. She served on it for 3 years and was responsible, among other things, for the acquisition of a proper library of school books from a publisher in Chicago, which she negotiated by letter with a persistence that Harold Busby, who handled the post, found admirable even if he wasn't entirely sure whose correspondence he kept delivering to the farmhouse. Joseph started school in 1885, 6 years old and solemn about it, presenting himself at the schoolhouse door with the gravity of a person commencing an important obligation. His teacher, a young woman named Miss Elaine Foster who had come from Iowa, could see Myrtle perfectly well and said flattering and accurate things about Joseph's quickness, which Myrtle received with the particular mixture of pride and deliberate underreaction that is the hallmark of mothers everywhere. Phineas went to see his mother in Independence in the spring of 1886, bringing Joseph with him because the boy was old enough now, and because Margaret Reed had been asking to see her grandson with increasing urgency, and also because Phineas thought there was something important in Joseph knowing where his father had come from. They went by train, Joseph's first train journey, which he regarded with a focus and intensity that had Phineas answering questions for 4 straight hours. Margaret Reed received them at the door of her house, in Independence with an enthusiasm that was entirely undimmed by geography or age, and Joseph studied his grandmother with the same green-eyed assessment that was so familiar from his father. And within 2 days, they had established a rapport based on Margaret's stories about young Phineas and Joseph's evident appreciation of these stories as historical data. Phineas spent those 2 weeks in Independence thinking about his father, walking the streets where he had grown up, standing at the grave in the churchyard and understanding, with the particular clarity that comes from having built something worth pointing to, that he had done what his father had not managed to do, which was make a life that added up. He felt no bitterness about his father, only a kind of compassionate accounting. His father had done what he could with what he had, and so had Phineas, and the results were different, and that was enough to think about. He came home in April to find that Myrtle had started a sewing circle in the farmhouse. 4 women from the surrounding farms meeting every other Thursday afternoon to do needlework and talk, which was a small domestic fact, and also the kind of quiet social anchor that turned a collection of farms into a community. She told him about it at supper the evening he returned, with Joseph describing the train in parallel narration at the other end of the table, and Margaret Grace listening to both with the discerning expression of a 3-year-old who is tracking multiple conversations. "You look happy," he said. "I am happy," she said simply. He looked at her across the supper table in their own kitchen in their own farmhouse on their own 40 acres along Slate Creek in the evening light of April 1886, and thought that this was not a complicated truth. She was happy. She had been invisible and alone for so many years, and now she was rooted in a life that was hers, that she had built with him, that held her and was held by her in equal measure. In the summer of 1887, Myrtle told him she believed there might be another child coming. She was not entirely certain yet, she said, with the careful precision she brought to all assessments, but she thought so. He was 37 and she was 33, and the thought of another child at this point in their lives landed not with the overwhelm of the first or the uncomplicated joy of the second, but with a deeper, warmer satisfaction, the feeling of a life continuing to be what it had set out to be. Their second daughter arrived in February of 1888, blonde and determined, and they named her Rose Clara, Clara for Myrtle's sister who had been central to their lives, and Rose because Myrtle thought she looked like one. Joseph, now 8 years old, received this development with elder sibling authority, explaining to Rose Clara from the earliest possible age how things worked, a project that Rose Clara accepted with the cheerful indifference of a baby who has her own ideas. Clara and Thomas came for that Christmas and every Christmas, the farmhouse filling year by year with more people and more noise, and more of the particular kind of happiness that comes from a family that has been built carefully and has decided to stay. Thomas had become, over the years, a genuine friend to Phineas, their initial cautious mutual inspection having given way to the comfortable ease of men who have spent enough time together to stop performing and simply be present. They discussed cattle prices and the railroad's encroachment, and the changes coming to the territory, with the directness of men who take the world seriously and are not afraid to disagree. The town of Caldwell was changing in ways that were not always comfortable. The wildness of the early years was giving way to something more settled, more institutionalized, which brought its own losses and its own gains. The saloon was still there, but somewhat quieter. The cattle drives were truly ending now, replaced by the enclosed ranches and the railroad cars. Some men who had thrived in the old way of things found the new way of things harder to navigate. Phineas watched all of this with the attentiveness he brought to everything, and he found that the changes troubled him less than they troubled some men, perhaps because he had always been more interested in what he was building than in the broader configuration of the world around it. The last years of the 1880s and the first years of the 1890s were years of gradual abundance for the Reed farm. The cattle herd was solid and well regarded. The land produced reliably. Joseph, growing into a tall, quiet version of his father, had decided at 13 that he intended to work the land alongside Phineas, a decision that Myrtle received with a mother's complicated mixture of pride, and the knowledge that this was exactly right and that there was nothing to be done about it. Margaret Grace showed a talent for numbers that Myrtle cultivated carefully, ensuring she had every book the schoolhouse could provide, and then some, writing to publishers in Chicago herself for additional texts when the school's supply ran short. Rose Clara was everything her name suggested, warm and vivid, and full of the particular willfulness that middle children often develop as a matter of survival. It was in the spring of 1892 that the Reed family attended the first proper community harvest celebration that Caldwell had organized in 5 years, A Saturday gathering in the town's main square with food and music, and the kind of informal socializing that Western towns had always done in the spaces between their difficulties. Phineas and Myrtle came with all three children, Joseph at 13 now and too old to be led anywhere but not too old to follow willingly, Margaret Grace at 9 organizing her siblings with the efficiency she brought to everything, and Rose Clara at 4 in a dress with a yellow ribbon that she had demanded specifically. The town looked different to Phineas than it had in 1878, more settled, more permanent, more itself. He recognized faces he had known for 15 years, people who had been part of this stretch of Kansas plains as long as he had, who had weathered the same summers and winters and changes and were still here, still showing up at Saturday gatherings with food and conversation. He stood at the edge of the square with his coffee and watched Myrtle move through the crowd with Margaret Grace's hand in hers, stopping to talk to Sally Dooley and a woman from the schoolhouse committee, and he watched the people around her, and he noted with a satisfaction that he kept quiet but that was nevertheless complete, that people greeted her. They stopped and spoke to her. They smiled when they saw her coming. Mrs. Harrington put her hand on Myrtle's arm in the way of an old friend. The schoolteacher, Miss Foster, who was now the married Mrs. Calloway but still teaching, waved to her from across the square. Myrtle Lawson, who had walked into this town 14 years ago with 2 bags and a frayed bonnet ribbon, and not a soul had turned to look at her, was standing in the middle of Caldwell's community square in the spring sunshine, thoroughly and unmistakably visible. He felt the weight of those 14 years, not as burden but as substance, the density of a life lived fully in a place that had become a home. He felt it in his chest, warm and real. Joseph appeared at his elbow, drinking lemonade and watching the square with his father's green eyes. "What are you looking at?" Joseph asked. "Your mother," Phineas said. Joseph looked at Myrtle across the square, and then back at his father, and something in his expression suggested that he understood more than a 13-year-old might be expected to understand about the nature of what he was watching. "She says you're the only person who ever really looked at her," Joseph said, with the directness of the young that is honest without quite knowing how honest it is. "She's told you that," Phineas said. "Not in those words," Joseph said, "but I could tell what she meant." He was quiet for a moment, watching the square. "I try to look too," he said. "At people, I mean, the way you do, to actually see them." Phineas looked at his son. The boy was tall and serious and had his mother's careful intelligence and his father's quiet stubbornness, and he was going to be a good man. Phineas could see that very clearly. "That's the most important thing I can teach you," Phineas said. Joseph nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already worked out. Myrtle caught Phineas's eye across the square and smiled. The full smile, the one that reached her gray eyes and made everything around her temporarily less significant. He raised his coffee cup toward her in a small salute, and she shook her head slightly with the fond exasperation that was one of his favorite of her expressions, and turned back to her conversation. Rose Clara came running across the square with yellow ribbon flying, and threw herself at Phineas's knees with the absolute confidence of a child who has never doubted her welcome. "Papa," she announced, "I want more cake." "I imagine you do," he said, lifting her up, and she put her arms around his neck and surveyed the square from her improved vantage point with the satisfied authority of someone who has solved a problem. The summer of 1892 settled over the Reed farm in all its usual abundance. The cattle were well. The garden was good. The creek ran clear and full, the cottonwood tree on its bank enormous now, 20 years older than the first morning Phineas had pointed it out to Myrtle and suggested she might eat her noon meal there, throwing a shade wide enough to shelter a family under on hot afternoons. They went there on a Sunday afternoon in July, all 5 of them, with a basket and a blanket, and spread themselves under the cottonwood tree the way you spread yourself in a place that belongs to you, without ceremony or effort. Joseph and Margaret Grace waded in the creek. Rose Clara built an elaborate construction of sticks and stones at the water's edge that she explained was a house, specifically a house for a horse, though no horse appeared. Phineas lay on his back on the blanket with his hat over his eyes and listened to the sound of the water and his children's voices, and the cottonwood leaves moving overhead. Myrtle sat beside him with her skirt spread around her, doing nothing at all, which was something she had only recently allowed herself to do, the full luxury of a Sunday afternoon with nothing required of her hands or her attention. She was watching the children and the creek and the summer afternoon with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, but it was a peaceful attention, an attention without anxiety, the attention of someone who is simply present in a good life and knows it. "Are you happy?" he asked, from under his hat. She was quiet for a moment. "I remember what I used to think happiness would feel like," she said. "I thought it would feel like being noticed, like suddenly becoming visible, like having people see me in a room. I thought that was what was missing." She paused. "And it is wonderful to be seen. It is, but that isn't what this is. What this is," she searched for the word. "Solid. It's solid. Like this ground under the blanket and the tree above us and the creek going past and those children in the water, all of it real and present and not going anywhere." He lifted his hat and looked up at her. She was looking down at him with her gray eyes warm in the July light, her hair loose at the sides of her face, the turquoise ring on her hand catching the sun. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." She reached down and took his hand, and he laced his fingers through hers, and the afternoon went on around them, the creek talking its usual low language and the cottonwood tree moving softly in the summer air, and their children playing in the light, and the sky above the Kansas plains blue and permanent, and full of everything that a good life can be built under. That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat on the porch in the lingering warmth, side by side on the bench he had built 3 summers ago from good cedar, with the fireflies beginning their small, unhurried performance in the grass along the creek path and the first stars appearing above the eastern horizon, and the whole farm quiet around them in the deep summer dark. "I've been thinking," Myrtle said. "About what?" "About a letter," she said. "To your mother. She hasn't been well this spring, you said. I thought perhaps we should go to Independence before the summer is out. Take the children. Let her have them." He thought about his mother, alone in her house in Missouri, formidable and loving and considerably less energetic than she had been. He thought about Joseph and Margaret Grace and Rose Clara in that house, and his mother receiving them with all the authority and warmth she had always brought to everything important. "Yes," he said, "we should. And I thought," Myrtle continued, "that we might make a proper trip of it, go by train. Let the children see something beyond Kansas for a few days. Show them the Missouri River, show Joseph the city, give him something to measure his world against." He looked at her sideways in the dusk. She was looking ahead into the yard with the expression she had when a plan was fully formed and she was presenting it for approval that she was fairly confident would be granted. "You've already written to her, haven't you?" he said, the smallest fraction of a smile. "I wrote last week," she said. "She says come in August." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement but in the affectionate resignation of a man who has been outwitted by the woman he loves and is fine with it. "August," he said. "August," she confirmed. They went to Independence in August, all 5 of them, by train. Joseph watching the Missouri River from the window of the rail car, with the concentrated attention of a boy who is gathering information about the world, Margaret Grace reading the entire journey, and only looking up at the river crossing, because Phineas specifically told her she would regret it if she didn't. And Rose Clara asleep against Myrtle's shoulder for most of Kansas, and waking up in Missouri with the cheerful adaptability of a 4-year-old, who has decided that this is simply where she is now. Margaret Reed received them at her door in Independence with the energy of a woman who has been looking forward to this for months and is not going to let a difficult spring diminish the occasion. She held Rose Clara for a long time. She put her hand on Joseph's face and looked at him for a quiet moment and said, "You have your father's eyes and your mother's good sense. which is the best possible combination, and Joseph received this assessment with the gravity it deserved. She and Margaret Grace disappeared into the kitchen for an hour and emerged with the understanding that they were going to communicate primarily through books, and a list of titles had been generated. She held Myrtle's hands at the kitchen table on the first evening after the children were asleep and said, "You are everything I hoped for him," simply and directly, and Myrtle sat very still for a moment and then said, "Thank you, Margaret," in a voice that was very steady and that Phineas knew the cost of, and his mother nodded as though the matter was settled. They stayed 10 days. They walked along the Missouri River. Phineas took Joseph to see the rail yards, and Joseph stood and watched the engines with a reverence that was approximately equal to the reverence he applied to cattle, which was high. Myrtle took Margaret Grace to a bookshop that had 3 rooms and was apparently the finest thing Margaret Grace had encountered in her 9 years of life. Rose Clara made friends with the neighbor's cat and mourned its territorial nature. On the last evening in Independence, Phineas sat with his mother on her porch in the Missouri dusk, the two of them in the quiet companionship that had been their particular language since his father died, and his mother said, "You did well, Phineas." "With the farm," he said. "With all of it," she said. "With your life, with that remarkable woman in there." She looked at the lit kitchen window where Myrtle and the children were doing something involving considerable laughing. "I was worried about you before. Not that you were unhappy exactly, but that you were incomplete. The way a house is incomplete when it's built but no one's moved in." She paused. She moved in. He thought about the boardwalk, the July morning, the woman walking across the street with 2 bags. "She did," he said. "Don't ever take it for granted," his mother said. "I don't," he said. "I never have." She nodded, satisfied, and they sat in the Missouri dusk and listened to the laughter from inside the house. They came home to Kansas in late August, to the farm and the creek and the cottonwood tree and the cattle, and all the specific, irreplaceable reality of the life they had built. The summer was still warm, but the first edge of autumn was in the evening air, that particular sharpness that Kansas wears in the last weeks before the prairie goes gold. And when they rode from the station in Caldwell on the wagon and turned south along the creek road, and the farmhouse came into sight over the rise, Phineas felt the same thing he had felt every time he came home for the past 13 years, a recognition that was almost physical, the sense of arriving at the exact right place. Joseph let out a breath beside him on the wagon seat. "Good to be back," he said, with the full sincerity of a 13-year-old who means it. "Yes," Phineas agreed. Myrtle was looking at the farmhouse with the expression he knew meant she was seeing it fresh, the way you see a thing when you've been away from it for a while and return to find it exactly as you left it. The white frame house with the light through the kitchen window that Mrs. Dooley had been asked to keep going. The apple tree in the old garden, heavy with August fruit. The creek visible at the bottom of the slope, the cottonwood tree standing above it in the evening light. She put her hand on his arm. "Home," she said. "Home," he agreed. They lived well and long in that house on the creek in Kansas, and the years that followed were the years of a life that had found its right shape and held it. Joseph grew into a man who was exactly what a 13-year-old Phineas had predicted he would be, steady and good and attentive to the world in the way his father had taught him. Margaret Grace went to the Teachers' College in Wichita in 1898 and came back to Caldwell with a certificate and a dry humor about the experience that kept the family entertained for months. And she taught at the Caldwell schoolhouse for years with the same precision and care she brought to everything. Rose Clara, vivid and determined, married a farmer from Wellington at 20 and moved 2 counties away, but came back to the farm for every holiday with the absolute regularity of a woman who knows exactly where home is. The town of Caldwell changed around them, as towns do, the old wildness giving way to the settled routines of a community that had decided to stay. And Phineas and Myrtle watched it change, with the equanimity of people who have put their roots down deep enough that change in the surrounding landscape is interesting rather than threatening. In the long evenings of their later years, they sat on the cedar porch bench he had built in 1889, which had required replacement of 2 boards in 1897 and a new leg in 1902. And they watched the prairie evenings come in over the horizon and talked about everything and nothing with the ease of people who have run out of things to prove to each other and arrived at the good country beyond. The cottonwood tree by the creek grew enormous over the years, its trunk too wide for one person's arms, its shade a full acre in the summer noon. Their children had climbed it. Joseph's children would climb it too. It stood over the creek with the permanent composure of something that intends to outlast most things, and Myrtle had loved it from the beginning. From the first Tuesday afternoon Phineas had led her along the creek path, and she had sat under it and eaten cold cornbread in the noon light, and the world had begun to change. On a September evening in 1905, 27 years after the morning she had first walked into Caldwell with 2 bags and a frayed ribbon, and not a soul had turned to look at her. Myrtle Reed sat on the porch bench with her husband's arm around her, and the plains going gold in the last light, and the creek talking quietly below the slope and the apple tree heavy with its harvest, and she thought about the woman she had been then. Careful and alone, and so accustomed to being invisible that she had stopped expecting anything different. She looked at the ring on her hand, the silver band with the turquoise stone the color of a Kansas morning sky. 26 years and it still fit exactly right. "What are you thinking?" Phineas asked. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "That woman who walked into Caldwell in 1878, she said, had no idea." He pressed his lips against her hair. "No," he agreed. "She had no idea. She thought she was going to come and go and be forgotten," Myrtle said, "like she always had been everywhere else. And instead," he said. She looked out at the farm, at the evening light on the grass, at the creek below the slope, and the cottonwood tree standing above it against the darkening sky, at the lit window of the kitchen where Joseph's wife was making supper, and their grandchildren were making the particular noise of children who are completely at home. And instead, she said, she was seen by the one person who was never going to stop looking. He took her hand, the same hand he had taken for the first time on the bank of Slate Creek 27 years ago, in the September dusk of 1878, when they were 2 people standing at the beginning of something enormous that they could not yet fully see. She laced her fingers through his. The prairie evening settled over the farm, warm and gold, and full of the sounds of a life that had been built carefully and held well, and would go on past them into futures they could not know but were not afraid of. The creek moved past below them. The cottonwood tree stood in the dusk. The stars appeared above the Kansas horizon one by one, the way they always did, the way they always would, constant and brilliant in the enormous sky above the plains. And Phineas Reed held his wife's hand in the dark and did not look away.